So, when it comes to CSS, there's a few different ways to start implementing CSS into our HTML pages. One is called the internal style sheet. An internal style sheet looks something like this. Typically we do this in the head, and in that section where we would normally have, I think we talked about like the title tag that we talked about as far as just very, very generally meta tags and things like that, even though we're not going to go into a lot of detail in this semester. All of that stuff that it's not necessarily exactly literally visual, we put in the head. So literally visual we have, as far as like the page one, we have these anchor tags, we have this image tag, all of that goes in the body. Inside the head is where we typically have, again, stuff that is describing the page. And a lot of times this is where we put in what is called our internal style sheet. With the internal style sheet, what we do is we start off with a style tag. Then within that style tag, just like 90% of HTML tags, we have a beginning tag and we have an ending tag. Within that style tag, we would write our CSS syntax. So the code that would be specific to CSS, we would write within that style tag, and then that would actually apply it to our HTML. Before I get into the CSS syntax, let's talk about the other methods though. We can also incorporate in CSS with a style attribute. So last lecture we talked about attributes. We talked about the fact that the href is an attribute and the src is an attribute. And with a lot of HTML tags, and this isn't necessarily real, but just as far as like a template, we have tag name, attribute, equals, and then we have value inside of quotes. So we have some sort of attribute name equals value in quotes. So where the style tag is often called the internal style sheet, we also have what's called an inline style sheet. So inline style sheet would require us to put within any of our HTML tags, we put in an additional attribute that's just called style. So just like any attribute, we have the attribute name, which in this case is style, equals, and then inside those quotations, we actually have, again, that CSS syntax. So the syntax that we use for CSS would actually be the value for the style attribute. So the third way of including the CSS, and this is the way that we're going to be actually using, because this is much more the standard. I'm showing you these other two ways just to kind of give you an idea of other possibilities, but this is really the standard that we use, and this is what we're going to be doing throughout the rest of the semester. The third way of including CSS into our HTML is with what's called an external style sheet. So the first one is an internal style sheet, that's with style tag. The second one is inline style, which is using the style attribute. And the third one, which is the best, is what's called an external style sheet. So to create an external style sheet, what we're going to do is first, in brackets, we're going to create just a brand new file. You can go into File and New, and we get a completely blank file with nothing in it. What we're going to do is we're going to save this file as in the same exact directory. I can find my directory. We're going to save this file in the same exact directory as the index.html that we've been using. The file name that we're going to give it is style.css. Now, just like with images themselves or HTML files, the front of this file name doesn't really matter that much. We can call it style, we can call it style sheet, we can call it Jonathan. It doesn't really matter. What does matter is the extension in this case. In this case, it's .css. This is how the browser is going to recognize the fact that this is an actual external style sheet file. So the beginning of the file name doesn't really matter that much, as long as you're following the same rules that I told you about last time. And again, those rules are, we want to make sure that it does not include any spaces or special characters, so just letters or numbers when it comes to the file name. The only exception would be as far as like dashes or underscores, but for the most part, just try to stick to letters or numbers. And again, no spaces as far as the file names as much as you can. But as long as we end it with .css, then it's going to recognize this as our external style sheet. So we're going to, in this case, we're just going to simply call it style.css. And again, we're going to save it in the exact same directory as our index.html. So, just like with the style tag or with the style attribute, this is where we're going to write our CSS syntax, so the actual CSS code. This is where we would put that. So, what that CSS code looks like is this. First of all, and this is, I'm going to start off with just, again, a general template. But we start off with what is called a rule. Then we have a left curly brace, and brackets very often will kind of try to end that for you. There's ways of turning that off, but I can't remember offhand right now. We have a left curly brace after the rule, and then we have a right curly brace somewhere down below. Inside of that rule, inside of the curly braces for that rule, we're going to have a property, colon, and then a value, and then a semicolon. And then when it comes to that rule, we can actually have multiple properties and values. So, what is CSS and what are we actually using it for? We're using CSS to describe the different properties of our HTML. So within our HTML, we're going to set up, we're going to have many different anchor tags, we're going to have many different image tags, we might have many other like paragraphs and other kinds of header tags, and we're going to use HTML as a way to actually divide up our content. So again, the very first week we kind of talked about the fact that HTML is a markup language. You start off with the text, and then you actually put in that code saying, well, this is going to be bold, this is going to be italics, and this is going to be a paragraph. So we kind of break it up in that way. CSS allows us to add some more properties to those simple groups. So, yes, we make it bold, but what if we also want to add in a color to that? Yes, we make this a paragraph, but what if we want the paragraph to have a specific width and height? Yes, we create an image tag, but say that I want that image to have its own width and height. Maybe I want that image to have a border around it. Obviously, I can create a border in Photoshop, but if I actually do it within CSS, then sometimes it's a little bit quicker to apply that to all of my images instead of just one. So, a lot of times, for all the grammar fans out there, a lot of times what I like to think about when it comes to the HTML is that our HTML is kind of like the nouns. It's the actual subject, it's actually our content that we're actually dealing with. It is Jonathan, it is boy, it is car. The CSS is more like the adjectives. The CSS is kind of describing what those things actually are. So yes, we have car, but the CSS would describe that car as large, small, red, blue. It would actually describe the properties of that actual vehicle. Grammar fans out there? I don't know. But I'm just kind of, again, talking about just, again, like what we use HTML for, and this is what we use the CSS for. So we have these rules, and the rules are going to describe exactly what it is that we're talking about. Maybe we're talking about all of our anchor tags, maybe we're talking about one specific one, but that information is going to go into the rule. The property is going to be a very set word or a compound word that is going to describe something very specific about that object. So again, this is the width, this is the color, this is the text size. That's what a property is going to be. And the value is going to change dramatically depending on what the actual property is. Sometimes it's going to be a number, sometimes it's going to be a word. You could use a word to describe a color. Sometimes it's going to be a very specific choice of word. For example, we have a position property, and we have only a few different options for what we can set the position property to be. So, if you go to the class website, again, we have these two different links in here for W3 schools. I like to provide different resources just so that not only can you kind of see this on your own pace, but one of my favorite pages on W3 schools is this CSS reference, which is the second one. The CSS reference has a list of literally every single property that you could ever want to do in HTML. So it's alphabetized here, and it's in the very first column here. This is all the different properties you could ever need to do in CSS. In the second column, it basically describes what that property is, but if you click on any one of those properties, you're going to get more information about that property, about different options with that, and you also get this try it yourself button. And it has a kind of what you see is what you get editor, so that you can kind of change some things about this. This is actually using an internal style sheet. We can see that because we have a style tag. But again, the CSS syntax stays exactly the same whether it's internal or external. So you can actually take a look at this and make some changes to it and click run, and it will actually make those changes here on the right hand side. So the rule is actually describing what it is that we're talking about in one moment. Eventually our CSS is going to have multiple groups of this. So we're going to have one rule which might be talking about all of our anchor tags. And we're going to have one rule which might be talking about one specific image. But we have multiple groups of this so that the rule and the curly braces there can encapsulate multiple properties talking about one specific thing. So again, this is, for example, this first rule might be talking about all of our different anchor tags, some sort of rule, color, something that we want for all of our anchor tags. And the next rule might be talking about just one very specific thing, like this one image that we have in our HTML. Yeah. So we could use a body as one of the rules to kind of talk about different properties of the body itself. Yes. Any other questions so far? We're going to get into like what the rules and properties and values actually look like. But any questions about just basically like what we use CSS for? Okay. So, before we get too much further, we're going to need some content to actually work with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up, go to lipsum.com, we can grab some lorem ipsum. And I'm just going to copy these first two paragraphs here. And in our HTML, I'm going to, well, let's keep all that stuff so far. Let's go ahead and add in those other. I'm going to add in those other two paragraphs to work with. So around each of these paragraphs, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in the paragraph tag. So again, that is just the P tag. So I'm going to have a beginning P tag here, and an ending P tag at the end of what I'm calling this paragraph. Same thing for this one that starts with Donna at just to. Sorry, I didn't take Latin in high school. I took H2. It's just important. So if I actually look at this, I went ahead and saved my HTML. I still have the content from before. We might actually use this in other ways. In fact, for where we say page 1, let's go ahead and put in an H1 tag there. Just so we have that header. And we'll keep the rest of this for now. Let's take a look at this so far in our browser. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this index.html. So we have page 1 as an H1 tag. We have that link in there, we have this image, and we have a couple of paragraphs here. Within our HTML, now I know that we're excited to get into the CSS, but we always start with our HTML. We always start with what the content we're actually dealing with before we actually get into describing it. So within our HTML, let's go ahead and I'm going to make this second sentence, I'm going to make it bold. I'm going to use the strong tag. But again, strong and bold work exactly the same way. I'm going to make that bold there. I'm going to set the second sentence in the second paragraph. I'm going to make that also bold. And let's make the last sentence of each one italicized. So we'll use the EM, which again works exactly the same way as the I italics tag. So the reason why I'm setting up this HTML is so that we have something to work with in our CSS. There's lots of different ways to kind of call out the things that are inside of our HTML. But one of the most basic ways is just with the tag name itself. So we're creating these tag names throughout our content here, just so that we have something to work with in our CSS. So I have paragraphs, I have strong tags, I have EM tags, so this gives us something to work with. So, in our CSS, I'm going to go ahead and take this out. Again, this is just a template. This is just kind of an idea of basically how it goes. But the rule, like I said, can be simply the tag name itself. So again, we have several different tag names here. We have H1, we have an A, we have a paragraph. Let's start off with the strong tag. So right now, if I take a look at my HTML, actually in the browser, I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit so it's easier to see. We have this sentence here. We have that as a bold. We have the last sentence italicized for each one. So right now it's just simply black, and we have a slightly higher weight to it than it was normally. So for the rule, we're going to call out strong as the rule that we're of the thing we're actually talking about. The next, we're going to actually put in the property, which in this case we're going to put in color. Now, you would know this if you looked at any of the CSS references, whether or not you want to use the W3 Schools one, whether or not you want to use any sort of other CSS book as a reference. But color simply specifies the text color. So when we're talking about color, we're just talking about the color of the text. Now, there's a few different ways to actually put in color. The first is we can actually just write in a word. Now, brackets will try to help you out here. As you put in the colon, it's going to give you a whole bunch of different words that you can actually use as the color name. So we have anything from very basic things regarding red, blue, and yellow to even more kind of complicated things like blue, violet, and brown, and coral, and things like that. Now, we can put in the color itself as the value, so we can just put in red. And this would, in theory, turn the color of the text of our strong tag and turn it red. It's not going to work quite yet. There's going to be a couple things we have to add. But this is one way of using that color. However, I'm really not a big fan of using text for color. There's another way to incorporate in color, and that's with hexadecimal values. So where you get that hexadecimal value from is any sort of a design document. If you pull up this color picker that you've seen in pretty much every Adobe program, as you kind of pick the color, or if you eyedropper to the color you want, we have a whole bunch of different values here, and right here towards the bottom we have the hex. So this hexadecimal code describes exactly this shade of red. So not just red in general, but the exact shade, brightness and saturation of the red that we really, really want. So what we could do is we can use this hex value. We can use this hex value as another way of saying this color. So we can say color, and we can use that hex value. But if we're using the hex value, then we want to start off the value with the pound or hash number sign. So we can say color, and we can say red with the actual word, or we can say color, and we can use the hex value for that color. Now, one of the reasons why I really like using the hashtag with the color is because we can pick exactly what we want. If we just simply say red, then how do we know what color red that is? As designers as well as programmers, we want to have a bit more control than that. And while red would probably look the same on every different browser, if you called the text red, it would look the same on Safari and Chrome and Firefox. However, if we went into something like cyan, then Firefox might have a different idea as far as what cyan might be than Chrome does. It might just be a slightly different shade, and Safari might kind of do its own thing as well. So once we get into other different names, it's more complicated names, then we kind of lose that control. Whereas the hex value will always look the same through different browsers. Any questions on this so far? Okay. So, let's go with the hex value one. I'm going to delete this first line. So again, we have the rule up here. We have a set of curly braces, the left curly brace and the right curly brace. And we have the property, we have a regular colon, and then we have some sort of value, and then a semicolon. So the goal right now is this should be making all the tags with strong. It should be making that red, the exact shade of red that we picked out. By the way, feel free to put in as many different line breaks as you need to. It'll still work no matter how many line breaks you do. In fact, you can even put this on like multiple, well, actually, don't get too crazy with that. But feel free to space things out as much as you need to. The actual line breaks here a lot of times don't really matter that much. But yeah, so like I said, we're trying to turn the strong tags, we're trying to turn them red. Now, right now, if you go back to the browser and refresh, it's not actually going to work. What we need to do is we have our HTML file and we have our CSS file. We need a way of telling our HTML file that we're actually using that specific CSS file. So when it comes to internal style sheets, we can use that style tag, and then it's automatically going to apply that CSS. If we could have inline style, then it's automatically going to apply that CSS. When we have an external style sheet, then we have to tell the HTML file that we're actually using that file. The same way that we have this with the anchor tag, we have to tell the HTML file that we're linking to page 2, or that we're linking, or that we're trying to reference this exact JPEG in our image tag. The way that we reference an external style sheet is this. We do it in the head section of the HTML, and we're going to use a link tag. So, for the link tag, it's going to start off with just simply link. Now, this is one of those very rare HTML tags that does not have an ending tag. So there is no ending link tag, just like there is no ending image tag. But again, I want to stress that that's very, very rare. Most tags will have an ending tag. Now, whenever we don't have an ending tag, which again is rare, instead of simply having a right angle bracket like we do for this H1 or the beginning of this A tag, just like with the image tag, we're going to end with a slash and then a right angle bracket. So this is our link tag, and we're going to be applying different attributes within this. But we use the link tag in order to link our external style sheet file. So within this link tag, we're going to first put in REL, and that's going to be our first attribute for this link tag. So just like any attribute, we have the attribute name equals, and then we have quotes for the value. The value in this case needs to be exactly the word style sheet. So we have link, we have rel equals style sheet. Rel stands for relationship. So there's different kinds of links that we can have. The most common way that we use link is for style sheets, though. It's very rare that we use links for other things, but yeah, we do have to tell the browser that the reason we're using this link is for a style sheet. So we use exactly that text there, rel equals style sheet for any quarterly style sheet that we're going to be doing. Next, we're going to put an additional attribute. So after the quotation for the rel, we're going to put in href, just like we have for the anchor tag. So we have href inside of our link, just like we have for the anchor tag. We have the attribute name, href equals, and we're going to have the value in quotes. This works exactly the same way as the anchor tag and the src tag. The href for the link tag works exactly like the href for the anchor tag or the src attribute for the image tag, in the sense that the value that we put in there is going to be the path to the style sheet file, as well as the name of the style sheet file.
But did you call it just a style?
Yes.
Or the style sheet, or did you name it just a style?
Yes. So the file name that I used is just style.css. However, I could call this, well, actually, sorry. Give me 1 second. So if we have this href here, we need to say the path to this style sheet and the name of it. So in this case, because it's in the exact same folder, we can just simply say style.css in the href. If we had it inside of a CSS folder, so we have that style.css file inside of a CSS folder, then we would put in css/style.css. Again, the same way the href and the src work. Now, I'm going to keep it in the same directory, so I'm just going to call it style.css, and I'm going to, again, move this file inside the same folder as the index.html. Now, like I said, you can call this style sheet whatever you want. We can call this week 3 .css, and I would change it here in the href. Now, despite what we actually call the style sheet, we still want to use where it says rel equals style sheet. That is the standard no matter what. So that has nothing to do with what we actually call the style sheet. We just simply need to make sure that the link says rel equals exactly style sheet. But again, we can call the style sheet file itself, the CSS file, whatever you want. Style.css is pretty common. You're going to see that a lot. I'm going to do that a lot. But again, file names are up to you. So I'm going to go back to style.css, and we're going to call this in the href style.css. Does that answer your question? Okay. So we have link, rel equals style sheet. We have the href style.css. So we have our link tag, and that exists inside of our head. Link is one of those rare tags that does not have an ending tag. So if we go ahead and save this and we refresh the page, now we're actually seeing our CSS applied. So now that bold text is not just black, but it's actually the shade of red that we picked out in Photoshop.
But you can also include the style sheet inside your HTML. I mean,
Yes.
without creating another.
Yes. So within the head, you can actually put it in a couple of different places, but the head is most common. We can put in a style tag. And just like we did in the external style sheet, we can use that exact same syntax. So we can say strong, then those curly braces, color, and then whatever that actual color was. So this, doing it this way, and again, this is called an internal style sheet, as opposed to this is called an external style sheet. Well, if we do it this way with the style tag, this would work the exact same way. Technically, there's nothing wrong with doing it this way, but we very often have an external style sheet that tends to be the standard. And the main reason why it's a standard is because we can share it between multiple HTML documents. So if we have 5 different HTML documents, 5 different pages, like we're going to do for the website, yeah, they're all going to share the same exact style sheet.
Basically, the template or something like that.
Yeah, very much so.
The pages that you are going to create.
Exactly. Now, while the content's going to be different on all of our HTML pages, one is going to have a video, one's going to have a photo gallery. Some of the rules that we're going to set up in our CSS is going to be different depending on what that actual content is. However, all of our pages should share certain things. Like, for example, the menu. Say that we have a green background for the menu. We don't want to, if we decide to make that a slightly different shade of green, we don't want to have to go back into every single one of our HTML files and change that in the style tag. If we have something standard, like a menu, and we have all of our HTML files linked to the same exact style sheet, then we can change it in one place, anything that is standard throughout all of our websites.
Affect you at the whole library? So when you are creating a whole library, then you pull out.
Sure. I haven't heard it referred, the external style sheet referred to as a library before, but it could be one way of thinking about it. But basically, all of the HTML files would be sharing that, ideally, would be sharing that same CSS file. So even if we reference certain things like, say that we have something referencing a video in our style sheet, even though it's shared on another HTML page that does not have a video, that doesn't really matter. What we use the external style sheet for, rather than internal, is for those things that are being shared throughout everything.
Say like you want the same header on every page. You have to go back to the HTML style sheet with the like the pages, like the template of a page.
Yes.
In that page, is that header specific?
There are ways of doing that, but however, that's not going to be something we're going to be going over this semester, because that actually kind of involves more complicated languages in order to actually have an HTML template that would be shared throughout all of the other pages. So when it comes to the HTML, yes, we're going to have certain HTML that's going to be a series of links, like anchor tags, and yes, you will have to copy that for every one of your HTML files. So unfortunately, yes, if you decide to change anything about your menu, like the text in it, like say that we say, like, instead of the word about, say we want to call it information or something like that, then yes, you would have to go into all your HTML pages and actually change that word, because that's the literal word that we're actually using. However, if it's something like, again, something that actually describes that content, like the font size, the color, the weight of the text, and something that's actually describing that, then we can put all of that inside of our external style sheet, and we can change that in one place. Yes?
I went to the restroom, so can you just quickly explain why the CSS is in HTML?
So I was showing that we can also do the exact same CSS that we did in our external style sheet. We can do that exact same syntax inside of the style tag with the what we're calling an internal style sheet. Again, the reason why, and again, if we're just dealing with one, maybe we're dealing with just one HTML page, then yeah, let's just use an internal style sheet. It doesn't really matter that much. But whenever we're dealing with multiple pages, and it can just be a good standard no matter what, then we use the link and we use an external style sheet so that, again, we can kind of share certain properties. But I just wanted to kind of show that syntax would be exactly the same if we decide to do an internal style sheet. Any other questions? Yes I am. It doesn't pick up my voice that well, but hopefully it'll, yeah. And I also will try to remember to provide the files online as well, the end files, if that helps. Any other questions before we move on? Yes.
Unrelated, what's the span tag?
So the span, I really like the span tag. Can we hold off on that? Because we are going to be going over, because in the next CSS, whatever class, whether we're going to be doing this on the 15th or the week after, we're going to be talking a lot about positioning. And when we talk a lot about positioning, we're going to get into div and span, because they can be extra helpful when it comes to actually doing those layouts. Basically span is kind of a blank template that allows us to apply whatever we want to it. But like I said, I'll get into it in a little bit more in the following lectures. Yes?
So far you've shown the internal and the external.
Yes, and like I said, for the most part, in this class, we're just going to be using external. But again, I want to assure you that the CSS syntax is the same no matter where we're actually putting it. But we're going to be using an external style sheet just because that tends to be a bit more the standard. Oh, yeah. So again, with the internal, we use the style tag, and then once we actually have that style tag, the code that goes inside of that is the same, no matter what. And we typically put that style tag in the head. Technically, you could put it in the body, but it's, like I said, standard we put it in the head. Yeah. I'll sometimes use an internal style sheet if there's something very specific that I don't necessarily need to share between my different documents. Like, for example, if there was style that I wanted to set up for a video that, all the other pages don't have videos, maybe I'll use an internal, but it's pretty rare. A lot of times we just use externals for everything. Yes.
Different lines. But if you were actually doing this, would you have that, for example, the internal, would you have that all on one line, or do you actually, what's kind of the standard procedure, like when you have style and then two lines, strong, bracket, and then next line, color, and next line, and
For the most part, it's up to you. So the thing is, this will still work. You'll sometimes see different programmers will have CSS like this, kind of all in one line. This will still work as long as you have the correct order of your syntax. So as far as like these left curly brace, we have this right curly brace, we have this semicolon. As long as you have the syntax itself in the correct order, this will still work. And in fact, you can actually have, the whole thing on one line if you really wanted to.
I guess you just get some confusing trying to find it.
Yeah.
If you see that something doesn't work on the index page, going back to the selector and find it.
Exactly. And the thing is, like I said, there's so many different ways, even when it comes to the rules, there's so many different ways of talking about the same exact HTML. A lot of coding, believe it or not, there's a lot of personal preference when it comes to a coding style. While there's certain standards which make things work or not work, there's also a lot of flexibility for kind of your own style. I often like to say that coding is very much a conversation with your future self. So you want to make sure that your code is as clear as possible to you in that moment, because eventually you're going to have to come back to your code and be able to know how to edit it and read it. So you want to make sure your code is as clear as possible. If you ever have any questions about like the specific formats that I do, if you just want to say like, well, does this have to be this way or like that, please feel free to ask me. I will let you know because again, I want this to be clear to you as much as possible. Yes. No, you can take that space out. That space itself doesn't matter. Any other questions so far?
But what about the spacing between the headline and the do you close that space?
So, when it comes to, you're talking about like spacing like here?
Let's say that I have a title and I want to be no space between the title and the paragraph.
Oh, okay. So, I don't know if we went into the line break. So right now, there's a couple of different ways of handling it. One is that and we're going to be getting into this a little bit more in a couple of lectures, but there's what are called block level elements, which are elements that will automatically be on its own line. So you can see that this H1 tag, this H1 tag is kind of on its own line. It creates a natural line break right after it. If in my HTML, if I'm trying to put this anchor tag right after the H1, so in my code, this is exactly on the same line, that's not going to make a difference in the browser. The browser is still going to put the anchor tag on the next line. So there are things called block level elements which are automatically going to stand on their own line. And in contrast to that, there are things called inline elements like the strong tag or the EM tag, which will be in line with everything else. So, and again, we're going to be getting to this a little bit more detail when we talk about layout and positioning, but the block level elements like the H1 tag and paragraph is also a block level element. We'll naturally put an extra line break there. Now, if you want to manually put in a line break, like say that I want a line break between this link to page 2 and this image here. We have this anchor tag with the link to page 2. We also have this anchor tag which holds the image tag. And even though they're on different lines in the HTML, all of these are inline elements, so they're going to be on the same line. If I want to manually put in a line break, then I use the BR tag. Now, BR is one of those rare elements that does not have an ending tag. I know I keep saying rare elements, but I swear there's only like 5 of them. 5 out of like 100 of them. But BR is one of those rare tags that does not have an ending tag, and it just creates a manual line break. So wherever we have that BR, and just like with any tag that does not have an ending tag, we end it with / angle bracket instead of just the angle bracket. Although this will also still work. This is more the standard, and it will work more often, basically. But anyway, we have this line break, which will create a manual line break between wherever we actually put it. So that's how we can create that manual line break. And we can actually have multiple manual line breaks if we want to create a little bit of vertical spacing between this link and this image. So that will create basically just manual breaks in between those two. Now, the height of these manual breaks, which by the way, these could actually even go on the same line, and it doesn't really matter. The browser does not care too much how you space out your HTML, it just cares about the syntax itself. So even if I have these on the same line, the browser doesn't care about that. It's putting in 4 line breaks no matter what. Yes, so that's where we get into the CSS. So we can use the manual line break, or we can use block level elements like the H1 or paragraph to put in just like one space or a couple of manual spaces. However, the reason why we like CSS is because we can get even more specific. We can get very, very detailed with exactly how much space we can put between things. This manual line break is kind of almost an arbitrary height as far as like what constitutes like that space there, how much space that actually is. So we would typically use CSS methods to create exactly the amount of space that we want between things. as we need to.
File the BR tag?
Well, typically we wouldn't style the BR tag, but there is what is called line height, and the line height, let's take a look at that. So, let's say that we want to create some extra style with our, let's talk about our paragraphs for a second. Right now we have a very specific size to the text of our paragraphs here. If I go in to the CSS, which, by the way, brackets does have a way of viewing the CSS and the HTML at the same time. If we go into view and vertical split, then you'll actually get HTML right next to, I'm sorry, you'll get two documents right next to each other. So you might actually have to kind of drag one into the other area, but you could potentially have this side by side. I don't know. I don't want to get too confusing with it, so maybe I'll just kind of go back and forth. So in our CSS, say that we want to specify anything else about the text here. What I'm going to do is, just like I called out the strong tag, now I'm going to call out the paragraph tag. So I'm just going to put in P for paragraph. And inside the paragraph tag, the P is going to be the rule in this case. And inside that rule, inside the curly braces, I'm going to put in font dash size. Now with font size, we have a few different options. You'll sometimes see people put in points, like 13 points or like 16 points with a PT. However, that is something that can sometimes look a little bit different from browser to browser. A much more reliable font size to deal with is pixels. So if I put in 10 pixels, then this is going to be a lot more reliable when I look at it on various browsers. I mean, it's not going to be a dramatic change if we did points instead of pixels. But like I said, pixels tends to be a lot more reliable than points. You might sometimes see people actually put in like inches and centimeters. Definitely don't do that. There's no reason to put in inches or centimeters with any sort of measurement with CSS. I don't even know why it's allowed. But it's just going to be very unreliable from browser to browser. So when it comes to font size, I would highly recommend pixels. There are also a couple other options out there, but for now, let's just go with pixels. So if I put in 10 pixels for the paragraph, then when I take a look at this, I can go to refresh, and it makes the text a lot smaller. Now, on my browser, I can go ahead and zoom in and zoom out on the page, and obviously that's making things bigger or smaller. You, as the web designer, can unfortunately not control. For the most part, you as the web designer cannot control how people want to zoom in and zoom out on their browser. It's a personal preference. However, you can set basically the standard so that if someone has their browser at 100%, you can assume, like, as far as like what the size of the text and different images and things like that are going to be. So at 100%, that's what 10 pixels looks like. So that's kind of small. But I can make this font size, kind of whatever makes the most sense for my content, and also, again, for my audience, and what font size I want for that. Now, font size is just the size itself of the text. You can also put in what is called line height. So the property in this case is line dash height, and that can also be measured in pixels. So normally, if you do not put in a line height, there is a default out there. Normally for just about everything. That's an important thing to remember. When it comes to any sort of tag, again, except for div and span. It's one of the reasons why we like div and span, because it's completely blank. But with the exception of div and span, pretty much every other tag out there has some sort of property automatically set to it. There's some sort of default. For example, most browsers will use black text, a white background, will use a serif font, usually Times or Times New Roman, as what the defaults are. So whenever you need to specify something else, you need to actually specify that in your CSS. So I don't need to tell my CSS to make the text black because that's the default. I don't need to tell it to make the Times New Roman because I want a really boring site if I already want that to be that. I only need to specify something different if I actually want to actually change that style. So line height by default will give you a line height, a difference between the lines of the text. It'll use whatever actually works for that typeface. But we can specify that we want the line height to be maybe a bit bigger than normal. And unfortunately, I don't know what the normal actually is going to be, but I can say that I want it to be different by putting in line height of maybe 30 pixels and then refreshing it. And we see that it did not make that much of a difference because I guess it was already pretty close to 30 pixels. Let's put in something a bit more dramatic. Let's say 60 pixels. So, I'm, again, making sure that we're saving each time and refreshing each time when we make a difference here. So this is a line height of 60 pixels, and that's how that looks for this type size. Say I go back to the 30, and then I want to make the text size itself a lot bigger. So I already have a line height of 30 pixels, and we have a font size of 20 pixels. Let's say we set the font size to 40 pixels. The line height is the same, but the text size is a lot bigger. So now we actually have the text overlapping. The browser will let you do that. The browser will let you make a lot of bad decisions, but it gives you that control. So if we do not have a line height, then it's going to kind of just adjust that line height to whatever is kind of natural for that size and this typeface. But we typically put in line height if we're on purpose trying to make the space between the different lines either less or more than what it is naturally. So you can kind of use your own design education, your own design eye to see whether or not you want the text to kind of be whatever the default is. Like you first decide what the size is going to be. Like, you know, I want this text to be a little bit bigger, I want this text to be a little bit smaller. And then you can kind of take a look at it, and you can kind of, again, use your own design eye to say, I actually want these lines to be spaced out a little bit more, or a little bit less. With the line height, you have that option. But don't feel like you necessarily have to include that line height, because the default is usually pretty readable as it is. And we'll let you know, too. If you bring up a design and, you know, we'll also say, like, I don't know, I think maybe you should space that out there. Any questions so far? Okay. There's a lot more CSS stuff that I want to get into, but I don't want to forget about the font typeface stuff. Okay, so some bad news. Okay, so there are these things called. So first of all, when it comes to typefaces, if we want to change the typeface, the font family, we put in the property font-family, and then after font family, this is where we put in the name of the font that we actually want to use. So for example, the default on most browsers is Times New Roman, or Times, depending on whether you're Mac or PC. So if we want to set it to a sans serif, like Arial, we can put in that font name. We're going to end it with a semicolon. And let's see how this works out.
You need to have if it's not available, is that going to be no?
That's a good question. I'm going to be getting into that in just a second. So right now I changed the font family to Arial. By the way, you'll notice that I put the font family inside the paragraph tag, which means that it's only applying to these paragraphs. It's not applying it to the header, it's not applying it to this anchor tag that we have up here. It's only applying it to the paragraphs, because I only have font family inside the paragraph tag. Typically, we deal with the typeface inside the body. We create a body rule, and we put the font family in there. So I'm actually going to cut and paste this into the body. Then you'll see it applies to all of my text. It's putting, almost looks rounded. It's weird. It's putting that typeface on all of my text, not just the paragraphs. So you want to be careful about like how you're actually, where you're actually putting that information. The body is encompassing all of my HTML. We end the body right at the end, and we start the body at the very beginning, which means that any sort of properties I put there is going to apply to all of it. So, a lot of times we'll decide things regarding the typeface, like anything that should be the default kind of throughout our entire website, like the typeface, in the body. So, a lot of times you'll see, I'm going to go back to this. I should actually include this link on the class website as well. A lot of times you'll see font family looking something like this. We have Times New Roman inside of quotes, we have a comma, and then we have times, and we have a comma, and then we have just the word serif, all before the semicolon. Everything between this colon and the semicolon still constitutes the value. We're going to be getting into some properties where the values might start to look a little bit complicated. It really all depends on the property. But what I have highlighted here is still all part of the value for this property. So let's break this down. Between each comma, it's talking about a different typeface. We have Times New Roman, we have times, and we have just simply the word serif. You might say, Jonathan, I don't know if you know this, but Times New Roman is the exact same thing as times. Sort of. On PC, the PCs typically like to call it Times New Roman, and the Macs typically like to call it times. And computers are stupid. So you have to be very, very specific with computers. So if I just put in times and we're viewing this on a PC, the PC might say, I don't know what times is. I know what Times New Roman is, but I don't know what times is. And if I just put in Times New Roman and I'm on a Mac, the Mac might say, I don't know what Times New Roman is. So we put in all three of these options. We put in Times New Roman, we put in times, and we just simply separate them out with a comma. What the browser is going to do is it's going to try the first. If it can't find that, it's going to go to what's after the next comma. And if it can't find that, it's going to go to whatever is in the end. Very typically, within the font family, you'll find a few different options. And the options typically end with either the word serif or sans serif, basically saying if the browser can't find any of these other fonts that I have on here, just use whatever serif you could find, or just use whatever sans serif you could find. So we can have them, we have a few different options here, and again, the browser will start with the very first one, and it will keep going as it can't find that. Oh, one other thing is, as far as the quotes, we only need the quotes if the name of the font has spaces in it. If the name of the font does not have spaces in it, then we don't need quotes. There's nothing wrong with having the quotes even if it doesn't have spaces, but we absolutely need the space. We absolutely need the spaces if it does have quotes in there. So, for example, Arial is actually more of a PC thing. So if I wanted to work also on Mac, I would say Arial, comma, Helvetica, comma, and then I would put in sans-serif, because I'm telling the browser, I really want you to use Arial. If you can't find that, then try to find Helvetica. If you can't find that, then just use whatever sans serif you can find. So, that's how the font family works. We can either put in one, but it's much more recommended to put in multiple, so that the browser has those different options. So, the bad news. So the bad news is there is a very limited number of what are considered web-safe fonts. These are the fonts that pretty much every computer has when it rolls off the assembly line. So when it comes to serif fonts, we have Georgia, we have the Palatino, which is also called Book Antiqua, on other computers. I'm not sure which one's PC, which one's Mac, but we have this font, which looks like this. We have Times New Roman, and we have those three options for serif fonts. We have Georgia, which looks like this. We have one of these, which looks like this. And we have the Times New Roman, which looks like this. When it comes to sans serif fonts, we have the option of Arial/Helvetica, which they look about the same. We have Arial Black/Gadget, which looks like that. We have Comic Sans. We don't have that option. You don't have that option in my class. Some of these other ones, again, don't really look that great. But these are what's considered web-safe fonts, whereas you can put this into your font family, and you can be sure that every single browser is going to be able to show that. So, say that I have something like Futura. Every graphic designer knows what Futura is. Everyone should have Futura on their computer. Unfortunately, every person does not have Futura on their computer. So, that means that it's not considered a web-safe font. One option that you can do is you can put in Futura, comma, so that way, if they have Futura, great. If they don't, then, I don't know, I guess use one of those other safe fonts. So what a lot of people will do is they'll put in whatever their preference is, and then they'll end with one of those safe fonts, so that, again, the browser has those different options, and it's not just going to go to default. So that's the bad news, that there is a very, very limited number of those web-safe fonts, and again, I'll try to make sure this is on the class website as well, just so you have this link. Now, the good news is this. The good news is you can put in specialty fonts in a couple of different ways. One is with Typekit. So if you have an Adobe subscription, you have a Creative Cloud, you should have access to the Typekit. There's a couple of different options with the Typekit as far as exactly how many fonts you have available to you. But with the Typekit, you're going to find some more of the common professional-looking fonts, like Futura, like Garamond, like things like that, which would be a little bit more common. But these are always licensed fonts. These are fonts that a type designer spent a lot of time and patience in actually creating, and they want to make money off of that. So these are all licensed fonts. And again, you'll typically find more professional-looking things here. So if you kind of do a search for the fonts you're actually looking for, this isn't going to have everything in the universe, but it's going to have a lot, or at least something that's pretty close to what you actually want. You can go through and you can kind of see, like, to make sure that it's the font that you actually want. You can kind of take a look at it in different ways as far as the different weights, the different sizes, things like that. But eventually, there's a way to actually, once you actually choose that, to actually put this, make this an option on your website. That's with the Typekit. And I want to show you this other one. So with the Typekit, again, we have a specific library, and that's only if you have a Adobe subscription. Another option is Google Fonts. So if you Google Fonts, then you'll come to Google Fonts, which is the first option, or just fonts.google.com. This is also where you can get other fonts that you're going to be able to use on your website if you include it in another way. So Google Fonts is not going to have licensed fonts. It's not going to have Futura or anything that is a font that the designer wants to get paid for. These are all free. These are people that just wanted to create a font and make it free on the internet. Which means that sometimes you're going to get stuff that's not going to look, that great, but you'll still get some that look pretty good as well. And you can use these different categories to say like what it is you're actually looking for, and you can kind of search out different things like that. When you find one that you really like I like this Karma one. Let's go ahead and click on that as far as the title of it, and we can kind of take a look at it in a lot of different other ways. And in order to include this font on my website, What I want to do is, once I'm on the page with this, I would go to select this font. And we have this box which comes up in the bottom right. Google Fonts, we don't need a subscription to it. It's all free because Google is just nice like that. When we click on this for the family selected, it's going to give us a bunch of information. I would recommend reading this, but the main thing that you actually need out of this is the first thing that's going to come up. It's going to have a couple of different options here, but you're going to look for this link tag. So this link tag that you see here is going to look very much like the link tag that we have for our style sheet. So you're going to look for this link tag, and you're going to copy that, and you're going to put that in the HTML. You're going to want to put this before your custom style sheet. So I'm going to put this at the very beginning of the head section, but most importantly, I want to make sure it's before my custom style sheet. So I'm going to copy and paste it exactly as is. Next, in your CSS, on the Google Fonts website, it's going to say how to call this out in your CSS. So this is just simply the word karma. Now you might say like, well, come on, I can tell automatically. You do want to double check that wherever it has the font family, because whether it has spaces in it, whether it has dashes in it, you just want to make sure you call it out the same exact way. So we're going to put in font family and then karma and then serif, and we're going to put that in our CSS. So I'm going to put it in the body. Now at this point, once I have the karma font in there, after the comma for that, I can still put in whatever I want. Like I'm still going to say, on the off chance that whatever the Google font isn't working, I still want it to default to Arial, Helvetica, or whatever sans serif. So I'm going to put all of that in. So the Google font requires two different things. Once you actually search out and you go to the page you actually want, you're going to click this, select this font, which should be in the top right. It's going to have a box there. It's going to give you a link, and it's going to give you a font family. So you copy the link tag into your CSS, copy the link tag into your HTML in the head section, and you copy the font family into your CSS wherever you want that to be applied. And like I said, most commonly you want it to be applied to the body if that's going to be your default. So I'm going to I saved the HTML, I saved the CSS, and if I go back to the website, as I refresh that, it's now using that karma font. So, the bad news is there's very few website fonts out there. Boo. The good news is that with Typekit and Google Fonts, we have a lot of other options out there that we can use as what's called body copy. Now, I didn't show you how to do this with Typekit. Typekit is slightly more complicated than Google Fonts. They've tried to make it easier, but hopefully if we have time, I can show you that. But I'll also include a tutorial on the class website. I got a lot of homework. I'll include a link on the class website that will also have a tutorial how to do this with Typekit. Like I said, it's just slightly more complicated than Google Fonts, but you should have that as an option. Now, when it comes to your design, what's a design that I have readily available? Give me a second here. Okay. Oh, this needs to... So say I have this design here. Say that I have like a lot of different typefaces throughout here with this particular page. You always have the option of exporting something as an image. So say that you have, like, I just really like the text that I'm using for this identity up here, and I really want to use that typeface, but unfortunately it's not available in the Google Fonts, it's not available in the Typekit. You can still export that as an image. That's perfectly fine. Don't stress about that. Where you want to use live type, where you want to use like real text and that's not an image, is typically wherever you have what's called body copy. So, for example, on the about page, your body copy is going to be those couple of paragraphs. The history page should have several paragraphs with a body copy. However, whenever it comes to something like the menu, especially the identity, feel free to export images for that if you need to. The reason why I'm telling you that is as you do the design, again, create your design whatever you think is the best for that design. Don't stress too much about like what it is, like, well, I don't know if I can accomplish this or not. Start off with just making the design the best you can, and we'll worry about the rest of it. But just as a heads up, whatever you're doing as body copy, I would try to find something that's going to work either in the typekit or with the Google fonts for the body copy. And there's nothing wrong with just simply using a very common sans serif or serif for body copy. But when it comes to, as far as your identity, whatever you have as kind of like a type logo for your website, what you're doing for the menu or any sort of headers that you're going to have in your design, then I think you would definitely do want to get a little bit more creative with the typeface and create something, find something that's going to work especially for your subject line. And in those cases, if you cannot find in Google Fonts or the typekit something that's going to work in that case, again, exporting it as an image is definitely an option. Any questions?
I do have one. That's kind of going back to the style sheet.
Yes.
So when you create your .css file and you do something like the bold or paragraph as you do in your document, and you save that, it's going to save those rules for everything in your document. So you made the strong red, and anything that you use the tag strong is going to be red. Now suppose you just draw one line that's just bold but not red. Do you just use the opposite like B, or how do you?
Well, there's a couple of different ways of handling that. One is that because we do have access to both B as well as strong, you could separate out that way. You could say, I'm going to say B for anything I want black and bold, and I'm going to use strong for anything I want red and bold. So that's definitely an option.
But what if you don't? But what if you're using a tag that doesn't have an opposite?
So that we're going to get into in the very next lecture. We're going to get into what are called classes and IDs. Classes and IDs are ways within the HTML of saying, I want this very specific paragraph, this very specific length, this very specific anchor tag to have a different style than anything else. A class is a way of setting up, as you might guess from the name of it, is a way to set up like a group of things. So maybe I want this group of anchor tags to be red and this group of anchor tags to be purple. I can use a class for that, where an ID would be something very, very specific. Actually, if you guys have just like 5 minutes, if you want to go, I completely understand. But if we want to put in exactly as you're saying, for this paragraph, if we want to include an ID, within this paragraph I would add in an attribute. This is going to have simply ID equals, and then the quotes, that's going to have the value. The ID can be anything that you want as long as it does not have spaces and special characters. So I can call this maybe first paragraph. And I'm not, even though I'm using multiple words, I'm not using spaces or special characters in here. But I have a first paragraph. Within my CSS, in order to identify that, the rule is going to look slightly different. This rule can look one of two ways. Either we can put in $sign and first paragraph, or we can specify P first paragraph. So both of these are talking about the exact same thing. This is mostly a personal preference option. I like to do it this way because, again, coding is a conversation with your future self. So by doing it this way, I'm reminding myself that I'm applying this ID to the paragraph, to a paragraph. whereas this does not tell me what HTML tag I'm doing. So from here, I could put in a separate color, and that is, I never really went into the X thing, but anyway, that is some kind of green. So first paragraph will now be green, while all other paragraphs do not have that specification. Just a first paragraph.
No, not HTML.
So it's yeah. Oh yeah. So the attribute itself is called ID, and then we have first paragraph. Yes. Yeah. So the other thing I was just discussing was called classes. Let's say that we set up another strong tag, and I'm going to use the attribute class equals and then quote, and then I'm going to put it in a class name. Again, class name just like the ID name, no spaces or special characters. I'm going to call this blue text. I'm going to do the same thing for this other strong tag down here. I'm going to give it class, and I'm going to use that same exact class name, blue text. Again, no spaces or special characters. In my CSS, if I want to refer to that, I'm going to say strong dot blue text. Now again, just like with the ID, I can just also have dot blue text without the strong. Both of these will work the exact same way, but I like to do it this way because again, I'm reminding myself what that tag is. Yeah. So this, I can say color, and then that is a version of blue. So now just those first two strong tags, that ones that have that class, are now blue, while all the other ones are red. Because in my CSS, all the strong tags should be red, but the strong tags that have the class blue text should now be blue. We'll review this in more detail, and again, the next lecture, but I want to just quickly show you those options, because yes, you absolutely, in your build-up, will have different classes with different IDs to specify very specific rules, more than just the tag itself. Yeah.
The Google font isn't working for me, so can I show you?
Sure. Yeah, I can take a look at it. Yeah. So classes are, again, ones that you use the same exact thing in a couple of different places, where IDs are one that you're only using once in that HTML document. But like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about this next time.
So anytime I say class in HTML, I'm back to
Yes, class, so I call this class blue text. That means nothing in the HTML without us specifying it in the CSS. So yes, we have class within the HTML, but the reason why we do that in the HTML is to specify it in our CSS. Yeah. Any other questions? I gotta talk about making this class longer. But yes, as always, as you have any questions, feel free to email me. But that's also the purpose of the Tuesday section as well, so you can ask David. But I really enjoy answering questions, so don't feel like you're just like, oh, well, Jonathan's gonna get annoyed. He's gonna say, just ask Tuesday. No, I want to answer questions as well. So feel free to email me questions as you have them. Again, for the homework, try to use as many of the different properties as we went over today. Try out the class and ID thing as well. See if you can get that working. But at the very least, we'll say the very, very minimum of what you're supposed to have for the HTML thing. Have an external style sheet, reference color, font family, font size, I'll also write this up on the class website. But some of the properties that we went over today. But as an option, I would also say try out the ID in the class thing as well to see how those work. And yeah, so also we're working on the design this week. So we're working on the design. Next class, we're going to be critiquing it here so that you can get some feedback, so you can change it up. Hopefully we'll have a little bit more time to go over some other stuff syntax-wise. But as always, feel free to show your design to other people outside of this class. Feel free to submit it to me early if you want to get some advice and feedback before class. And I will, in addition to
create the page using as much of this as possible, but it doesn't have to necessarily be part of our design.
Oh yes, yeah. So the thing is, you have the HTML page where we're just practicing some of the stuff that we've gone over. The design, however, I don't want you to force you to use like font family or color, things like that in the design. That's just going to be Photoshop anyway. But yeah, you're not forced to use very specific properties in your design. If that makes sense. So I will. I'll send an email out once I do all of this.
The design is not necessarily live. It's basically a
Yes.
PSD or a JPEG of what we want our about page to look like. And then, so there's two components items really. There's the HTML page and what we've learned. And then there's the design to just kind of get a design together for our about.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, along the way, let me know if you have any questions. Look for an email from me in the next couple of days, because I will definitely update the class website with additional links, as well as I'll try to spell out some of the stuff with the homework a little bit more. And at some point I'll have this